There is a moment that happens inside an avoidant person that they will never tell you about. It does not happen while you are together. It does not happen during the breakup. It happens months later, sometimes years later, in an ordinary Tuesday afternoon silence, when they are sitting alone and they suddenly realize that the most emotionally alive they have ever felt in their entire adult life was the exact moment they chose to walk away from you. And here's what is strange. They did not know it was the best thing in their life when they had it. They only know it now that it is gone. And you need to understand why, because once you do, you will never look at avoidant behavior the same way again. I want to start with something that behavioral psychology calls the proximity paradox. It is the documented phenomenon where the closer we get to something emotionally overwhelming, the more aggressively we move away from it. Not because we do not want it, but because our nervous system has been trained to associate deep emotional connection with danger. This is not a character flaw, it is a survival strategy, and it explains almost everything confusing about the person who made you feel chosen, then disappeared. But here is what nobody talks about. There is a second half to that paradox. Because once the threat disappears, once the pressure of real intimacy is removed, the nervous system does something remarkable. It starts to miss the very thing it was fleeing. And for the avoidant, that reversal does not happen quickly. It happens slowly, privately, and with a kind of grief most people watching from the outside will never even see. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand something about human attachment that most therapists will not tell you in a 50-minute session. Let me tell you something about how avoidants are built. And I say built deliberately because avoidant attachment is not a personality type you are born with. It is a psychological structure you construct over years, usually starting in early childhood, when emotional needs were either consistently unmet, unpredictably met, or met with strings attached. The child learns a very specific lesson. Needing people is costly. Emotional vulnerability leads to disappointment or punishment. And the safest strategy in life is to keep a version of yourself hidden from everyone around you. By the time that child becomes an adult, they have become extraordinarily good at it. They appear self-sufficient. They project calm. They navigate relationships from a comfortable emotional distance. They can be charming, even deeply engaging, but there is always a wall. Always a part of them the other person cannot fully reach. And for most relationships, this system works fine. Because most people interact at the level of the wall and never try to climb it. And then they meet an empath. An empath does not attack the wall. They do not demand you take it down. They simply start noticing things nobody else noticed. The sadness behind your humor. The exhaustion behind your independence. The loneliness you have decorated so carefully it looks like freedom. And the avoidant feels something happen inside them that they have almost never felt before. They feel seen. Not performed, not managed, actually seen. And for about 30 seconds, it is the most beautiful thing they have ever experienced. Then the panic starts. Researchers at the University of Delaware studying attachment behavior found that avoidantly attached adults showed significantly elevated cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, when presented with emotionally intimate scenarios, even when those scenarios were described as positive and safe. Let that land for a moment. Their body is treating love like a threat, not metaphorically, chemically. The same stress response that activates when you are in physical danger activates when emotional closeness becomes real for an avoidant person. So when the empath starts reaching the hidden self, the avoidant's nervous system is not experiencing intimacy, it is experiencing an alarm. And everything they do next, the distance, the confusion, the withdrawal, the strange coldness that appears out of nowhere, it is not cruelty, it is survival behavior responding to a false threat. But here's the open loop I want you to hold on to right now. That alarm, that panic, that withdrawal, none of it deletes the emotional experience that triggered it. The feelings do not disappear when the avoidant runs, they get suppressed. And suppressed emotion does not stay quiet forever. We will come back to that. First, I need you to understand what the empath represents to an avoidant at the biological level, because this is where the psychology gets genuinely fascinating. Human beings have what neuroscientists call mirror neurons. These are brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it. They are the neural basis of empathy. They are how we feel what other people feel. And empaths, whether by genetics, early experience, or both, tend to have unusually high mirror neuron sensitivity. They do not just understand your emotional state intellectually, they feel it physically. For most people, this level of emotional attunement is pleasant but not transformative. But for an avoidant person who has spent their entire life defending against emotional exposure, encountering someone who feels their hidden interior without being told about it creates a unique neurological event. It is like someone walking into a room you thought was locked and saying quietly, "I have been here before, I know this place, and it is okay." That experience bypasses years of psychological defense. It does not break through the wall, it goes around it. And what reaches the avoidant in that moment is something they have been protecting themselves from their entire life. The possibility of being fully known by another person. Not just the curated version, the actual version, the scared version, the version with all the unresolved grief and hidden hunger and exhaustion from years of emotional self-sufficiency. And for a brief window, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, the avoidant allows themselves to receive this. They lean slightly toward the warmth. They let the empath see more than they normally would. They feel something beginning to shift inside themselves. Something that, if they were being honest, feels terrifyingly close to hope. Then the system kicks back in. Because emotional hope for an avoidant is not just hopeful, it is dangerous. Hope means vulnerability. Vulnerability means exposure. Exposure means potential rejection. And if someone who has truly seen you rejects you, the damage is catastrophic in a way that rejection from a surface-level relationship never could be. So the avoidant does not just pull back from the empath. They pull back from the version of themselves the empath was beginning to reach. And this is the part that destroys empaths. Because from the outside, it looks like rejection. It looks like they were too much, or not enough, or somehow did something wrong to cause this reversal. But what actually happened is that the avoidant caught a glimpse of their own emotional depth, and it terrified them. The empath was not the problem. The empath was the mirror. And the avoidant is not ready to look at what the mirror shows. Now here is where the second act begins, and this is the part the competitor script skims over. The part that actually changes how you live your life when you understand it. After the avoidant retreats, after the empath grieves, after the relationship ends or goes dormant, something starts to happen inside the avoidant that they will not admit to anyone. They start comparing. Not consciously at first, but every new interaction, every new conversation, every new attempt at connection gets measured against an invisible standard. And that standard is the emotional frequency of the empath they walked away from. Psychologist John Bowlby, the founder of modern attachment theory, documented what he called the internal working model. It is essentially the unconscious blueprint your brain uses to interpret all relationships based on your most formative emotional experiences. What happens when an avoidant person experiences genuinely deep emotional connection with an empath, even briefly, is that it rewrites part of that blueprint. It creates a new reference point for what connection can feel like. And once that reference point exists, it becomes impossible to delete. This is why avoidants seem fine at first after separation. They feel relief. The pressure is gone. The emotional exposure is gone. The nervous system stops sounding alarms. They move through the world with their independence restored, and for a while they think they have made the right decision. They might even date new people relatively quickly. Enter new dynamics that feel easier, safer, less emotionally demanding. But something is wrong. Conversations feel flat. The new connection lacks a quality they cannot name. Emotional moments feel shallow. Nobody seems to reach the interior the way the empath did. And slowly, with increasing frustration, the avoidant starts to realize that they have not moved on from an intensity. They have moved down from a depth. And living at a shallower depth starts feeling like holding their breath permanently. And then the grief starts. Except it does not look like grief to anyone watching. It looks like distance. It looks like distraction. It looks like a person who is functioning completely normally. But internally, in the quiet hours, in the unguarded moments, the emotional material they suppressed during the relationship starts surfacing. Memories arrive with emotional information attached to them that was not accessible before. Because when the avoidant was inside the relationship, their nervous system was too activated to actually feel. The alarm was too loud. But now in the silence after, they can finally hear the signal underneath the noise. And what they hear is that they lost something irreplaceable. The University of California published research on what they called emotional inhibition in avoidant attached adults, finding that avoidants actually do experience the full range of emotional responses during romantic relationships. They do not feel less. They suppress more. And those suppressed emotions do not dissolve. They accumulate. And when the relationship ends and the suppression motive disappears, those emotions process in a delayed flood that avoidants experience as confusing, destabilizing, and sometimes completely overwhelming. This is what the empath watching from the outside never sees. They see someone who seemed cold during the relationship and then appears fine after it ends. But what is actually happening inside the avoidant is the reverse. They were surviving during. They are grieving after. Now I want to give you something here, because understanding the mechanism is one thing, but I want you to understand why the empath specifically, not just any person, why the empath is the one the avoidant cannot get out of their system. Most people who encounter an avoidant stay on the surface. They get frustrated by the wall and either accept it or leave without ever pushing through it. But empaths are different because they do not actually try to push through the wall. They simply behave as though the hidden self behind the wall is already real to them. They ask about it. They leave space for it. They respond to emotional signals the avoidant never even intended to send. And this does something to the avoidant that nothing else does. It makes their hidden self feel real. Not possible, not theoretical, real, acknowledged, witnessed. Because another human being is responding to it. And when your hidden self, the part you have been suppressing, protecting, and isolating for years, when that part of you is responded to with warmth and gentleness by another person, it does not just create connection. It creates an experience the avoidant has likely never had before. The experience of being emotionally safe while being emotionally honest. And that experience does not stay in the past. It follows them into every future relationship, into every future moment of emotional closeness. It sits in the background like a tuning fork, vibrating quietly, reminding their nervous system of the frequency that once felt like home. But here is what I want you to understand, and this is the open loop I mentioned earlier that I have been building toward. The avoidant missing the empath is real. The regret is real. The delayed grief is real. None of that is manufactured. But here is the thing that matters more than any of that. The thing that has life-changing implications if you are an empath who loved an avoidant. The avoidant's eventual realization is not a sign that the relationship would have worked if you had just waited longer. It is a sign that they were not ready, and those are two completely different things. Because here is the cruel irony at the center of this entire psychology. The avoidant does not fall for the empath they rejected. They fall for the memory of the empath. And memories do not have needs. Memories do not have boundaries. Memories do not ask for emotional reciprocity. Memories are safe because you can love them without being required to show up for them. What the avoidant falls in love with in absence is a version of the empath that requires nothing of them except the quiet processing of unresolved feeling. And the real empath, the one who had needs and boundaries and was hurt and grew and moved on, that person has become someone new, harder to reach, less willing to wait, no longer organizing their emotional life around someone else's unresolved fear. And when the avoidant eventually surfaces, sometimes with that text at 2 a.m. that starts with, "I have been thinking about you," what they find is not the person they left. They find someone who has already grieved them and rebuilt. Someone who knows the difference between being loved by someone and being loved by someone who is ready. And that discovery, that the door they once closed can no longer be opened from the outside, this is often the moment the avoidant truly begins their own work. Not because you punished them, not because you played a game or executed some strategy, but because the natural consequence of their own pattern finally landed with undeniable clarity. There is a concept in behavioral science called experiential avoidance. It was developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes, and it describes the tendency to suppress, escape, or avoid internal experiences that are emotionally uncomfortable, even when that avoidance creates more suffering long-term. It is considered one of the core mechanisms underlying anxiety, depression, and relationship dysfunction across virtually every major psychological disorder. An avoidant attachment is, at its core, a form of relational experiential avoidance. The avoidant is not avoiding you. They are avoiding the feelings that being close to you activates. And here is why this matters to you directly. Because the empath has a mirror image problem. Just as the avoidant oversuppresses emotional experience, the empath often overprocesses it. They feel everything, analyze everything, try to understand everything. They build elaborate psychological models of the avoidant's inner world while neglecting to apply that same deep insight to their own needs and limits. And the result is that empaths frequently stay in proximity to emotional unavailability far longer than any reasonable cost-benefit analysis would support. Not because they are naive, but because their nervous system is literally wired to attune to distress in others, and avoidants are broadcasting distress signals constantly, just at a frequency most people cannot hear. The empath hears it, and they mistake the distress signal for an invitation. It is not an invitation. It is a symptom. And one of the most transformative cognitive shifts an empath can make is learning the difference between sensing someone's pain and being responsible for healing it. You can understand someone completely. You can see their wounds with clarity and compassion. You can genuinely love them through their most defended and guarded moments, and still not be the right person to save them. Not because you are not enough, but because saving requires the participation of the person being saved. And an avoidant who is not yet willing to look directly at their own emotional architecture cannot be rescued by even the most emotionally attuned love on earth. This is the part most empaths learn the expensive way. But here's what I want to leave you with, and I want you to actually think about this rather than just hear it. The fact that an avoidant eventually comes to understand the value of what they lost. The fact that they carry your emotional imprint in their nervous system. The fact that they compare every future connection to the depth you offered. None of that retroactively makes the relationship safe. None of it means the next version with them would be different. Unless, and this is a significant unless, they have done the actual psychological work. Not thought about doing it. Not recognized intellectually that they have avoidant patterns. Actually worked with a therapist or structured process to rewire the attachment responses that drove their behavior. Because insight without behavioral change is just a more articulate version of the same problem. The avoidant who texts you 6 months later with emotional clarity, but no actual change, is still an avoidant. They are just an avoidant who now understands themselves better, while still being emotionally unavailable. Understanding the cage does not open the door. Now here is what changes everything. For the empath who is currently in the middle of this dynamic, feeling the confusion and the grief and the almost unbearable uncertainty of loving someone who runs from what they claim to want, here is the most psychologically accurate thing I can tell you. Your capacity for depth is not the problem. Your intuition is not the problem. Your emotional availability is not the problem. The problem is the direction you have been pointing those gifts. Because an empath who turns that same depth of perception inward, who applies that same emotional precision to understanding their own patterns and needs and boundaries, who stops organizing their nervous system around someone else's unresolved fear and starts organizing it around their own expanding clarity, that empath becomes genuinely untouchable. Not cold, not guarded, not closed off, but clear. Deeply, quietly, sustainably clear. And clarity is the one thing that makes both outcomes possible. Either the avoidant does their work and you can meet each other at a new level of mutual readiness, or you move forward with such understanding of your own worth that you stop waiting at doors that open inward. Both of those outcomes are better than where you are right now. Avoidant attachment is not a life sentence for the avoidant, and empath-avoidant dynamics are not a destiny you are locked into. They are a pattern, and patterns, once you can see them clearly, can be changed. Not immediately, not without friction, but changed. The avoidant can learn to tolerate the emotional aliveness that intimacy creates. They can develop the capacity to stay present inside vulnerability instead of evacuating it. This is documented. This happens in therapy, in structured attachment work, in relationships where both people understand the mechanism and choose each other consciously rather than reactively. But it requires them to stop outsourcing their emotional security to the distance they keep from everyone. And it requires the empath to stop confusing emotional understanding with emotional obligation. You can understand someone's wound completely without letting them practice it on you indefinitely. Remember that. Because the most profound thing this entire dynamic reveals is not something about avoidance. It is something about connection itself. That the depth of a bond is not measured by how smooth or easy it is. It is measured by how much of the hidden self was reached inside it. And the reason avoidant empath connections feel so impossibly significant to both people is that they are. Something real happened there. Something that most relationships never approach. And that reality deserves to be honored. Not by staying inside a painful pattern, but by taking what you learned from it and building something with someone who is actually ready to build. The avoidant fell in love with the empath they rejected because the empath showed them a version of themselves that was more emotionally alive than anything they had allowed before. And the empath loved the avoidant because they sensed the depth beneath the armor and believed in what was hidden there. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was enough on their own. And timing, readiness, and the willingness to feel without running are the missing pieces that love alone cannot provide. If anything in this video hits somewhere specific and real for you, leave a comment below with just the word "seen," because I read them. And I want to know how many of you are sitting with this right now. Subscribe if you want the kind of psychological insight that makes confusing relationship patterns finally make sense. Because next, I am going to break down the exact behavioral signals that tell you whether an avoidant is genuinely healing or just giving you a more sophisticated version of the same withdrawal. And that one might change everything.